Checking off something from my bucket list today. I am at the United States Military Academy at West Point, New York. It's about 50 miles north of New York City, and with 4,300 cadets here, this is the United States Army's main training post for officers. And was established in 1802 during the Thomas Jefferson administration. It sits on the spot that was first established as a military post by the Continental Army in 1778. It was West Point that Benedict Arnold agreed to turn over to the British as part of his defection during the Revolutionary War in 1780. Just south of here is where Major John Andre was hanged for his part as a spy in helping make that happen. But what I want to visit with you today is the post cemetery. Very few places on Earth have the amount of history that this place does. This cemetery sits in the middle of the military post. You actually have to go to the visitor center, fill out a background check to get a pass to be able to set foot on the military academy post so that you can visit this cemetery, which is deep inside this 16,000 acre site. But I'm going to visit some of the more prominent graves here, and there are hundreds of them. I'm only going to see some of the highlights. I'm not going to talk about every single one of them. I will talk about a few, but for the most part, I'm just going to show you some of the graves here. So let's take a look. Behind me is one of the most prominent graves that you will find here in this cemetery, and it belongs to General Dan Butterfield. Dan Butterfield was a Civil War general. He commanded the brigade that included at one time the 20th Maine Infantry, which was made famous by Colonel Joshua Lawrence Chamberlain. It was during the Civil War in 1862 that General Butterfield composed or arranged from an earlier composition what we now know today in the United States as taps, which is played at military funerals. It's played at dusk on military bases. It's one of the most well-known bugle calls, if not the most well-known bugle call here in the United States, and it was composed by Dan Butterfield, who also was a recipient of the Congressional Medal of Honor. And you can see on the pillars it shows some of the places that General Butterfield fought during the Civil War. Now, not on his original marker, but down here you see the mention of him as a recipient of the Medal of Honor. Well, here you find the grave of Brevet Major General George Armstrong Custer. He graduated last in his class here at West Point, hurriedly rushed into the field along with a number of other men to take part in the American Civil War, became a general, a Brevet Major General, which is an honorary title, and incredibly famous during the Civil War for his bravery and for his dash and kind of flashy persona. But of course he's best known as the man who was lieutenant colonel in charge of the 7th Cavalry at the Battle of Little Bighorn in Montana, where he and a significant portion of his men were wiped out by Indians, including the Lakota Sioux. After the men were killed at Last Stand Hill, they were buried hurriedly by other men, but a couple of years later a party was sent back to at least dig up and try to identify the officers. And the body that was believed, or the part of the body that was found that was believed to belong to General Custer, was brought back here to West Point and buried. There's a lot of debate about whether or not this is really George Custer. He may still lie at the field at Little Bighorn, but this is the marker that was placed for he and his wife.
so big, so powerful, so essential that they said, well, it must be organizationally separate. So it was toward the end of World War II, the Air Corps, with West Point Drag, didn't in the Air Force. So they just took their ranks and went right into the Air Force. So that explains this, as well as some others that you may see, where individuals have that.
West Point, the cemetery, officially became a military post cemetery in 1817, but there are burials here long before that. There were Revolutionary War soldiers who were buried here from the fort, and there's also Molly Corbin, whose grave is behind me. It's right next to the chapel, which you can see right here at the entrance to the cemetery. Molly Corbin was the very first woman in American history to receive a military pension, not for her husband's service, but for her own. You see, her husband was part of the artillery component at the Battle of Fort Washington outside of New York City. And when he fell, she took up his post and continued to fire the gun herself, along with his fellow soldiers, until she herself was severely wounded. She was granted a full military pension for her own service after the war. She died in 1800, and she's buried here right near the entrance of the West Point Cemetery. As you can see, she was not originally buried on this spot. Her remains were moved here later, as it tells on the monument here. But there are graves here, unmarked, that predate the post cemetery. For my generation, it doesn't get much more famous than Stormin' Norman. H. Norman Schwarzkopf, the man who was in charge of the military forces in the Middle East during the first Gulf War back in 1990-91. Very well known. He was on TV, did a great job kind of communicating the mission of what was happening, and he's buried here right near the front of the cemetery. I believe his father is also here. His father was famous in his own right. I believe his name was also Norman Schwarzkopf, and he was actually in charge of the New Jersey State Police, and he led the investigation into the kidnapping and death of Charles Lindbergh Jr., which at the time was considered the crime of the century. Just a few rows behind is General Schwarzkopf's father. Also, H. Norman Schwarzkopf, also a general, a major general. Military Academy class of 1917, just in time to serve in World War I. This is a grave right near the rear of the cemetery. Doesn't get a lot of press, but this is First Lieutenant Thomas Selfridge. He's known for a couple of things, unfortunately none of them good. Thomas Selfridge was in Fort Myers, Florida with Orville Wright about 5 years after the Wright brothers had invented the airplane. And they were doing a demonstration flight when the plane crashed. And I won't go into all the details of how that happened. You can look that up for yourself. Wright was severely wounded, very badly wounded. Thomas Selfridge died. He was the very first person in human history to die in a plane crash, and therefore also the first member of the military on active duty to die in a plane crash. And he's buried here near the very rear of the cemetery at West Point. This is the oldest section of the cemetery. Contains a number of unknown graves as well as a number of civilian graves. Well, this entire section behind me, 6 or 8 graves, all worthy of note. I believe all of them were men who served with distinction in the American Civil War, all of them at the Battle of Gettysburg. Right behind me is Alonzo Cushing, a lieutenant who's best known for his brave stand on July 3rd, 1863 during Pickett's charge. He was mortally wounded after having been seriously wounded several times before. He refused to give up his gun, continued to fire until he was finally killed. Just a few years ago, President Obama presented members of the Cushing family with his posthumous Medal of Honor, which was well-deserved and much overdue. Right next to him, General John Buford, probably more than any other single person responsible for the victory at Gettysburg because of his decision to stand and fight to the west and north of Gettysburg on the first day. Held the high ground until General Reynolds arrived with reinforcements and made it possible for the Union to set themselves up for victory. He died just a few months after the war of an illness. And then behind me, Hugh Judson Kilpatrick, famous cavalry commander in the Union Army. There are also a couple of other prominent Union commanders. I believe Charles Stone was a brigade commander at Gettysburg, and I'll show you a few of the others that are here as well. And just a few feet over from all of those graves that I just talked about, we have General George Sykes, who commanded the 5th Corps at the Battle of Gettysburg, prominent commander during the American Civil War. And then you don't get much more prominent than this one here. General Winfield Scott. In the beginning of the American Civil War, he was the commanding general of the U.S. Army. Couldn't command the Army in the field, eventually stepped down, let others take his place, but most well known for his command of the Army during the Mexican-American War. So much history here in such a small area. And then it's just a few more feet to get over where General Custer and Robert Anderson are buried.
Backs out the rest. Oh.
We're here buried next to members of his family is Lieutenant Colonel Ed White of the United States Air Force. Ed White, in addition to his service in the Air Force, was an astronaut with NASA. He was the first American to walk in space in 1965, but he's better known, unfortunately, for how he died tragically in January of 1967 as a member of the crew of Apollo 1 at Cape Kennedy in Florida. He, along with Roger Chaffee and Gus Grissom, were going through some tests, and a fire broke out in their capsule, which very quickly and tragically killed all 3 men. But Ed White is buried here at the United States Military Academy. Well, that's just a small glimpse of all of the history that is here at the West Point Military Academy. Walking around, you can literally see hundreds and hundreds of general officers, some of them 3 and 4 stars, people you've never even heard of who had prominent roles, but also thousands of colonels, majors, captains, just all of these people who had this incredible impact on our nation's history that will never be known. Because they were just one small part of really big things that happened. But I hope you get the chance. If you ever have a chance to visit, definitely check it out. It's worth your time. It's not a real big cemetery, but there's so much history packed into it. Thanks for watching.